And welcome to another new episode of Into the Fog. I'm Stephanie Tierney. Tonight on the program, Gary Flanagan is back for a part 2, and I'm really excited to talk to Gary about all the other stuff that we didn't get to the first time around back in, believe it or not, November. The time has flown, but stick around. I'm going to be talking to Gary about his music, probably his upcoming album, and some other things, so stick around. This is Into the Fog on Local 107.3 FM. And thank you for joining me again tonight. It is 8:02 p.m. It is February 20th, 2018, one of the more dreary times of year, but we have an exciting guest in the studio tonight, and that is none other than Gary Flanagan. Hello, Gary.
Hello.
Thank you. I'm good. Thank you for joining me again for a second episode of Into the Fog. And is Bijou going to be listening tonight?
You know, I left the radio on, so okay. I think, yes, she'll be listening.
Janelle and Bijou will be sitting there.
Yes.
Anxiously awaiting your answers. So if you're just tuning in and you've never heard this program before, Into the Fog is a program that started back in November, and Gary was my first guest actually on the program. And this program attempts to unlock some of the mysteries of the St. John independent and underground music scene by interviewing folks who were involved directly in that scene. And Gary was definitely a big part of that scene back in the early 2000s and right up until the mid 2000s. And as I mentioned in our other episode, you and I did a project together, which was the Suicide Cover Band. And now, as far as I understand, you're working on some new material.
Yes.
Before we dive into the past, how are things going with the new recording?
It's going fairly well, I must say. I think last time I had commented that the creative process has become a lot slower for me as I get older.
Right.
I often joke with people that, you know, back in my 20s, I could knock out an album in a few days, and now it takes me a few years. Right. But over the last couple of weekends, I've actually fired up the gear and just kind of sat down and played with some chords and came up with some melodies. So it is coming.
Okay.
And as I mentioned last time, I'm really, really trying to have a new album done by the end of this year. And I think that's very doable, and I'm very optimistic about that.
The Cats I've Known.
Possibly, yes. You remember.
Well, I was re-listening to our interview the other day, and that part really cracked me up when you mentioned that, because I think it's such an amazing album title.
Thank you.
Along with Paper and Chocolate and No Vandalism in Germany.
Yes.
Those are the other proposed titles for the album.
I love quirky titles. There's just something about quirky titles that really attract me.
Right. And you've had, and I think some of your early stuff now, this one, Rhapsody in Black from 2006, sometimes your album titles seem to kind of like take a common trope or a common kind of theme in titles and kind of twist them around a little bit.
Yes.
Do you like to play with that kind of stuff?
Yeah, well, it's funny you mentioned that, because one of my first albums was called Dressed in Black.
Right.
And that was actually put out by my friend Corey Graves. Back in the day, Corey ran his own little micro label called 11 Wave. And he put out an album called Dressed in Black, and he told me he chose the title Dressed in Black because that phrase appeared in at least 3 of my songs. So I do tend to have certain themes and certain, as you mentioned, tropes that really intrigue me and really fascinate me. I've actually written a lot of songs about cycles. I'm fascinated with cycles and how sort of there's like a 20-year cycle and things repeat, whether you're talking about pop culture or trends or technology. There seems to be these continual cycles that always pop up, and I'm really fascinated by that.
Yeah, and that seems like a thing which now you and I are old enough that we can probably recognize that those things do go in cycles, especially with fashion and music and things like that. Because I can remember being in like the early 90s and getting kind of moving away from punk, but moving more into like metal, and then the alternative thing happened. But it seemed to me around that time that there was a lot of kids my age revisiting the 70s,
Mm-hmm.
the early to mid 70s, and that was like Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and
Right.
Jimi Hendrix and all that, and the Doors, and that was kind of like, if you were a cool kid then,
Yes.
you were kind of like, ooh, well, I'm just really into old Zeppelin now, you know.
Right. And that was totally my story as well.
Yeah.
I remember I was in high school kind of in the late 80s, and 60s music was incredibly popular.
Right.
And as you mentioned, the Doors, the Beatles, all that sort of stuff, I really fell in love with all of that kind of in the late 80s. And to this day, I'm still a big fan of the Doors, the Beatles, Pink Floyd, all that kind of thing. And
Right.
it's interesting how that style kind of started in the late 60s, was revived in the late 80s, and so on. And it's really funny. I started doing my music in the 90s, and at that time, synthesizer was a very dirty word. Nobody wanted to have anything to do with synthesizers. This was at the heights of grunge, and people were basically giving synthesizers away.
Right.
And it was a weird time, but I still felt that that's what I was passionate about, and that's what I wanted to do. But I felt very, very, very out of sync with what was going on around me, and but I'm still glad I did it.
Yeah. Well, if it's any consolation, it seems like synthesizers are in vogue again.
Very much
like
so.
There's lots of electronic bands coming up now who are sounding very much like that early to mid 80s synth wave.
So. Yeah, and I'm actually quite happy when I see young people kind of discovering new wave and that sort of stuff from like the late 70s, early 80s, and I think for a long time the 80s were kind of ridiculed, and it was kind of like, oh, you couldn't admit that you liked 80s music or whatever. It was very, very sort of passé and uncool. But I've seen that come full circle. That's another example of a cycle where, as you said, a lot of younger people today seem to embrace it and are genuinely interested in it.
Well, and I think like it seems like younger people now are kind of embracing a lot of the sounds, like literally what the instruments sound like,
Yes.
but they're kind of morphing them into a new style of like, and I don't really know a lot of these,
Sure.
genres, but like witch house and vaporwave and like all that
Yes.
stuff. It seems like it's incorporating a lot of elements of 80s and like VCR culture. Even there seems to
very
be
much
like
so.
a lot of like the imagery, or even it'll have the little fuzzy sounds of
Yes.
like VHS tapes and stuff, which is, of course, like is a natural draw for me because I'm still kind of like very much in that world.
Yes.
And so it's like when you see those little triggers almost of like things like, ooh, this seems cool to me. It's like it's very retro-y and very like underground feeling again.
Very much so.
Yeah.
And I think the perfect example of that would be like Stranger Things,
Right.
which I love, and I can't wait for season 3. But I really love that show for many reasons, but one of the big reasons why I like it is I think they got it right. They really did a great job recreating the mood of the era, whether it be the clothes, the hairstyles, the music. They got it dead right. A lot of sort of film directors don't, but I think they paid a lot of attention to detail, and I think they really got it right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now your new album that you're working on, is it still very much in the vein of what you had been doing? Or no? Because I know, just because you and I are friends, that you've confided in me that you've been listening to a lot of house music and disco
Yes.
music, and so are you incorporating some of those sounds into your new album as well, or?
That's an awesome question. It's no secret. Anyone who knows me well knows that my tastes are incredibly varied.
Right.
If you listen to a Gary Flanagan mixtape, it will have everything from punk to disco to industrial to country.
Right.
I'm just, musically, I'm all over the map. And that's just the way I am, and it's the way I've always been. I can't really limit myself to one genre.
Well, that's fine.
Yeah,
that's fair.
so
that's exciting.
yeah, so I think with the new stuff, it's definitely going to be synth pop. It'll be similar to my earlier stuff, but a bit more mature, lyrically. I think it's going to be a bit more mature, a bit more, which only stands to reason, because when I made my first couple of albums, I was still in my 20s. Now I'm in my mid-40s, so my outlook on life has changed quite a bit. And that's going to be reflected in the songs, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
So when you reflect on your earlier days and your lyrics, do you find there's like I'm just curious now, you're mentioning about like the 25-year difference between when you started and where you are now. Are your lyrics still, because I know a lot of your earlier stuff, the lyrics were very fun and quirky, and I think there were times, especially on your last album, I think, where the lyrics got a little bit more serious. Yes. I can't remember the name of your last album. Was it?
Well, I did a techno album, and then before that, I did an album called A Clientele of One, which
that's the one I'm thinking of. Yeah, and that I felt like the lyrics and the music was a little bit more mature compared to like I Want Candy or whatever.
Yes,
or not I Want Candy, but so now, as you reflect on your early days and then on the stuff you're working on now, do you find there's a great disparity between the lyrical content of your early stuff compared to now? And what are you singing about now? What is Gary Flanagan singing about in 2018? That's what we want to know.
Great question. Well, yeah, definitely. If you look at my real early stuff, especially my first album, which came out in '99, most of the songs were about clubbing and dancing,
right.
Nightclub. We have the dance floor to ourselves. That's where my head was at that time. Clubbing was still a relatively new thing to me. I used to love getting dressed up and going out with friends and just spending a night just dancing and letting loose and having fun. That's not so much how I spend a typical Friday night now. So now I'm writing more about very human frailty. I'm very interested in the human experience, and what I mean by that is the foibles of the everyday person. There's actually going to be a new song on the new album called I Guess We're Adults Now. And speaking very much from the viewpoint of someone in their mid-40s and kind of the expectations, Sadly, I've always been a dreamer. I think on the last show I mentioned that I'm a real escapist.
Yes, yep.
And I find that in a very understated way, there seems to be an expectation when you hit your 40s or older, you're not really allowed to dream anymore. Or that's kind of a foolish waste of time, and that's silly. And I couldn't disagree more.
Yeah.
If I couldn't dream, I would lose it. And to escape and to create, that's incredibly important for me. I couldn't, if being an adult means, not dreaming and being grounded and being realistic all the time, I don't want to be an adult.
Right.
Basically.
Right.
But I think you can do both. You can be mature and you can be
playful.
Yes. Yeah. You can be responsible and you can be an adult, but at the same time you can also indulge your creative spirit. I really believe in that.
Well, I think it's just a balance, and I think it's something that parents don't really teach their kids.
Yeah.
They don't say like, okay, so when you get into your 30s and 40s, you've got bills and you've got your job and things get a little bit more serious, but you can also have fun.
Yes.
And I think our parents are like, not to get too off topic because we're really supposed to be talking about music, but I mean, we're also talking about your lyrics, but I mean, we follow by example too, right? So if our parents, I don't know about your parents, but my parents were quite, they could be funny, but they were also very adult to me, like very grown up. So it's like, oh, so when you get to that age, that's how you're supposed to be.
Right, yes.
And then I think we all kind of like just buy into that.
Yes.
And then it's not until we get a little further in, then we're like, this kind of sucks.
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to be like this. I want to just be like fun and have fun.
Janelle and I talk about this a lot. There's kind of this thing, people get very hung up on what you're supposed to do.
Yeah.
You're supposed to have a job by this age. You're supposed to be married by this age. You're supposed to have a house by this age.
And then at some point you realize that's all bullshit.
Yeah.
Pardon my French.
For many people, I would say, yeah. I think one of the hardest things to do, you hear this all the time, it's almost a cliche, but you hear all the time, be yourself and just be you and don't.
You do you, Gary.
Right. And I completely agree with that.
Yeah.
But I would also say that's probably one of the hardest things in the world to do.
Right.
For most people.
And I feel like there's not a lot of sincerity when people say that. It's almost like it's just become a thing that you should say to somebody.
It's like it's been marketed. It's like it's been
trademarked,
commoditized, and no, it's true. When I often hear that, I don't hear a lot of sincerity, and
or it's just become like a meme on Facebook or something. It's like live every day like it's, and you're just like, jog on. So well, that's interesting to hear that your lyrics and it doesn't completely surprise me that your lyrics would then, of course, take on kind of more of a reflective role as far as like looking back over the years and then looking forward to the coming years, which can be strange as you get into adulthood, and then looking forward to your senior years and all that kind of craziness. And it's like, whoa,
that really scares me.
I
was talking with Janelle about that the other day, that I met Janelle 16 years ago.
For those of you who don't know, Janelle is Gary's wife.
Yes, the lovely Janelle.
Yes.
And
hi, Janelle.
And so we met 16 years ago.
Yeah.
And I got thinking about that, and I thought, okay, 16 years ago. Well, I'm 45 now, and in 16 years from now, oh my God, I'm going to be 61, and just that blew my mind, and I really had to stop and not get all overwhelmed with it.
Yeah.
But I think the passing of time is, again, something that really, really intrigues me. The great poet Alden Nolan once said, he said, I think we should all think about death every day. And he said, I don't say that to be morbid. No. I just say that so that we should all sit down and realize how little time we have.
Right.
And to enjoy each day and to live to the fullest and to really to realize how little time we have.
Yeah. And I feel like that philosophy is very similar to like Eastern philosophy and like the samurai.
Yeah.
For instance, who I've read a lot about, they also had like a lot of lessons about like reflect on dying every day and being like ravaged by waves and attacked by bears and like what, no homework. But that whole thing about like life is short. And now let's go back, because I don't want to get too far out there, as you and I can often do when we're talking, but one thing leads to another. But I think in a way music is a really beautiful way to stay young and stay playful.
Oh, very much.
How do you
so.
feel about that? Reflect on that.
Completely. To me, music is it's not just a hobby, although it is a hobby that I love completely. I was actually telling a friend of mine recently, I not only enjoy being a musician, I adore being a music fan. And that is, if a favorite band puts out an album or a singer, I still genuinely get excited about that. That's the thing I find about music, for me anyway, is there's so much passion in it for me. Music has never let me down, ever. I met you. Pretty much all of my friends, all of my closest friends have come to me through music. Yeah. My wife came to me through music. Pretty much every good, positive thing in my life has come to me through music. So getting back to, music keeping you young and that sort of thing, I totally agree with that. When I see someone like Iggy Pop who can still rock like no one's business, and he's well into his 70s now, I mean, my God, I just think, I aspire to still be doing that when I'm in my 70s. I remember years ago going to see Leonard Cohen, may he rest in peace, and again, as someone who was, I think, pushing 80 and still
skipping across the stage, and still composing new songs that were just as good as anything he had ever done. And I just, there's something about music, to say that it's youthful is that it's true, but I think there's more to it than that. It's
for me anyway, again, it's the most therapeutic, reassuring, life-affirming thing I've ever encountered.
Yeah.
And I tend to be that way about the arts in general, whether it be movies, literature, photography, but there's just something about music that just kind of transcends all of that.
Yeah. And you can always find something to meet your mood.
Yeah.
So I mean, if you are feeling light on your toes and happy and skipping, and you can throw on something very upbeat, and
yes.
Then if you're feeling more reflective, there's lots of beautiful, and soundtrack music is so great. I just rewatched the movie The Revenant. I don't know if you've seen this film. Yeah, you saw it on the big screen.
I did, yes.
And I got sucked into the soundtrack to that movie.
Yeah.
It's so haunting, right?
Oh, I know.
And it can really you're probably I'm guessing you're probably like me in a sense that you also have to be careful with music, because sometimes it can take you down a path.
Oh, I think so, yes.
Like when it's very heavy or moody or atmospheric, that you can get kind of caught up in that thing, and then if you aren't careful, you can kind of be swept away by it.
Oh, very much so.
Yeah.
Music does have sort of that engulfing quality. And like you said, it can be a very a wave that's very positive, and sometimes a wave that's not so positive.
Yeah.
Oh, totally. I don't think it's any coincidence that, there's this stereotypical teenager who kind of stays in their bedroom moping, listening to dreary, depressing music.
Right.
That was me. I totally did that myself.
Yeah.
But as depressing or as morbid as that music may have sounded to other people, it was very comforting to me at the time.
Yeah.
It really, in a weird, dark kind of way, it brought me comfort. And I just find music is incredible for that,
Mm-hmm. Now, Gary, the last time you were in, you'll correct me if I'm wrong. I wasn't entirely sure if we had talked about your involvement in the St. John music community beyond music making. Mm-hmm. And I know, pretty sure that I definitely know you had done a zine, which was Night Waves.
Yes.
And were you involved in the community in other ways? And again, stop me if we've already talked about this last time, but I feel like maybe we didn't dive really deep into Night Waves. And I know you're a photographer, so did you ever contribute photography to any other zines or other projects, or did you do a radio program here at Local FM, or I'm just curious about your sort of extracurricular activities within the music scene here.
Sure. Well, definitely, you mentioned Night Waves. That was a zine that I started in 1999, and wow, it's hard to believe that was almost 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I just decided to put this zine out. It was basically, in the beginning, it was like 10 pages, 10 photocopied pages stapled together. In the beginning, I didn't do a whole lot of interviews. There was a few people local people that I had reached out to. I think.
Can you tell me who they were, or do you remember?
In the very first issue, I interviewed a local guy by the name of Ian Vale, and I don't even know Ian. If you're out there, please get in touch. I'm not sure what Ian's doing nowadays, but there was a number of local artists that I had reached out to. Certainly back at that time, I noticed you had the Night Waves compilation, which my friend Corey Graves and I had put together. Corey recorded under the name Creon, and he was one of the other artists that I kind of interviewed in the zine. Really, the aim of Night Waves was to focus on the underground electronic musician. I had this sense that there was a lot of bedroom musicians who were kind of creating all this weird, wonderful music and just not getting any sort of exposure or any sort of avenue. This was before Facebook. This was even before MySpace. This was
like right on that you said 99, which was kind of the cusp of
that's right.
The internet kind of exploding.
That's right. So really at that time there was no real avenues. And it just kind of grew from there. But I'm trying to think of some of the other local artists that I interviewed. There was a guy named Josh Darrell, who I think is in Halifax now, who recorded under the name The Void. I interviewed him. I interviewed my friend Rob Patey, who had recorded under the name of Ribcage and The End of Time and various other projects. So yeah, that was a real exciting thing.
Yeah.
In terms of photography, I've always been very enamored with photography from the time I was like 10 years old, but I kind of got away from it. And I just kind of stumbled back into photography maybe 6 or 7 years ago.
Okay.
So there hasn't been much of an overlap between the photography and the music. There's been a little bit, but not a whole lot. I think maybe I reached a point, I was having issues with clinical depression and anxiety, and I kind of stepped away from music for a little bit, and photography.
I remember you saying that last time.
Yeah.
Around 2006, you sort of
yes
moved away from it.
Yes, and it was shortly thereafter that I really fell in love with photography again. So yeah, that was very much, again, I keep using the word therapeutic, but for me, art is very healing, and God, I don't know what I'd do without creativity. I just go nuts. But on the other spectrum, I don't know if I mentioned this last time, but I was briefly involved with a group of organizers who we put on a couple of shows. We called ourselves BFM Productions. So it was myself, my friend Rod, and our other friend Jen. They were both based in the Fredericton area at the time.
Okay.
So we got together and we decided, hey, let's put together a show of electronic artists, and we called it Electrobash.
Right.
And
I think you did mention this. Was this the one that was at Gallery Connection?
Yes. So we did, the first edition was in Fredericton, and then Electrobash 2 was actually in St. John.
Okay.
And that was at the venue, the Deep End.
Okay.
And I did a few shows at the Deep End. That was an awesome venue.
Was that the venue that was run by Sam Blue?
That's correct. Okay. Yes. Okay. Yeah. I did a few shows there, and it was just a wonderful venue. I always found there was a great vibe there, and but yeah, just I've kind of become a bit of a hermit in the last few years. I've been a bit of a recluse and kind of haven't been very present too much, but still I'm very, I love the local scene, and I love to see people, new faces, and I love to see people thrive, and I love to see the people that I was working with almost 20 years ago still putting out albums. That genuinely makes me happy.
Yeah, well, and I think you're still, whether you believe it or not, I think you're still involved. I mean, you're still making music. Yeah. Now you have a podcast as well, which you post on social media. So you're still actively involved in that. And it's 8:30. So I should mention that you're listening to local 107.3 FM on your airwaves, broadcasting from the UNB SJ campus. If you're just tuning in, this is Into the Fog. I'm Stephanie Tierney, and I'm joined by Mr. Gary Flanagan this evening for a part 2 with Gary. And thank you again for coming back. And
thanks for having me.
I think you were genuinely excited to come back. I think
very much.
Maybe Gary Flanagan should come to local FM and do a radio show.
Well, hey, you never know.
Yeah.
You never know.
Yeah.
It's funny
because you do the podcast. I know now you play like more popular music or top 40 stuff, but
well, it's funny you say that because I've always toyed with the idea of doing another show. I'm a big fan of many different genres of music. I'm very much a fan of sort of music from like the late 70s, early 80s. New wave being a big example, but there's also another genre called minimal wave, which was kind of born in Europe, kind of came out of France and England and Belgium. And as the title implies, it's basically music done entirely on synthesizer that's incredibly minimal. There might be like one melody line and a couple of bass lines, and it's very, very...
Would Kraftwerk be one of those types of bands?
Certainly, they would have been one of the big influences. Yeah, just very...
This is post-Kraftwerk then?
A lot of it was, yeah. But I've kind of toyed with the idea of doing a radio show that would kind of focus on, these kind of weird and obscure, electronic music.
Yeah.
It's funny because years ago, it's just funny how life works, but years ago, I responded to an ad in the magazine Record Collector, which is actually published in the UK, and there was this guy who was looking for weird, obscure electronic music. And I got in touch with him, and I found out he was a DJ in France, and we ended up striking up a friendship. And he started sending me these weird and wonderful mixtapes, and it was all this stuff that I'm talking about, kind of ultra obscure underground stuff, European stuff from like the late 70s. And these tapes just opened my mind to a whole new world. And a lot of it actually ended up influencing the music that I was doing.
Okay.
But there was just something genuinely exciting about listening to some weird track that, you know, probably not that many other people had heard. And
Right.
Some of it was actually quite good. And it was just very exciting. I almost felt like he was my dealer, and he was sending me these things in the mail. And I would get genuinely excited every time one would arrive in my mailbox, and it was like, "Ooh, what's on this one?"
Did you keep in touch with him?
We've kind of lost touch over the last couple of years. I'm not sure what he's up to now, but he sent me probably a good like 24 tapes over the years, and I should really reach out to him and see what he's up to now. But
I wonder what he's listening to now.
Maybe he's listening to the show.
Yeah. So is minimal wave dancey?
Some of it is, yeah. Okay. There's actually there's quite a crowd for it. Not a huge crowd. It is very sort of fringe, but a lot of it, I would say, is quite dancey. A lot of it is quite moody, quite, you know, dark, very dark.
Okay. Cold,
even very sparse. But yeah, that's just one of the many genres that I love. I told you that recently I've kind of gotten very heavily into house music, dance music. I listen to a lot of that in my car. I absolutely love a song with a good beat. There's just, I don't know, I think I'll always have a soft spot in my heart for, you know, dance music. Yeah.
And you also are a big sucker for a hook.
Very much so. Yeah.
I noticed a lot of the music that you share on your podcast is like very hooky. It's got that big chorus or whatever.
Yeah. There's something about I don't know.
Is it the build up to the catchiness that gets you?
I think so. That's a big part of it. The structure. When you talk about pop music, I would be the first to admit that there's a lot of awful pop music, but I've always been of the mind that if pop music is done right, it can be art. It can really be art. There was a song from the 70s, I forget the name of it. I think the name of the band was Jigsaw, and I think the song was called Sky High or something like that. And I would encourage anyone to go on YouTube and find the song, because to me it's an example of perfect pop. Very well produced, hooky, very much sort of a sing-along chorus. I adore that stuff. I really do. Yeah.
So now if people were out there listening and wanted to hear your podcast, where could they find you on the internet?
If you go on, I post all of my episodes on a website called Radio for All. So it's actually radio and then the number 4 and then all.net. And pretty much every episode of my show is on there. And the name of the show is The Upbeat Music Hour. And as you mentioned, a lot of it is kind of oldies, kind of from the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But yeah, it's basically all on Radio for All.
Now, I haven't heard your latest one, but I saw you posted the other day, and I saw one of the artists on your playlist was Billy Idol.
Yes.
What track did you play with Billy Idol? Was it Blue Highway?
No, it was Rebel Yell.
Okay.
But I think I'm going to have to play Blue Highway on a future episode. I love that song.
I feel like you and I have talked about Blue Highway before.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I mean, I'm definitely I was listening to Madonna this morning.
Cool.
And checking out some Borderline and some Lucky Star, and that was
awesome.
I mean, you know, it's nostalgia, but it's also, like we were saying earlier in the program, it's like when you want to just feel upbeat and you don't want to listen to something very like downbeat and downtrodden, you can like really perk your mood with just your selections.
Oh, sure. Yeah. And there is something about, I had a discussion with a friend a while ago, and he was saying that, you know, because I listen to a lot of oldies, he was saying, yes, I think a big part of music can be nostalgia. I'm sure there's people out there who only listen to new stuff, but I would be the first to admit that the appeal of a lot of the oldies is the nostalgia factor.
Yeah.
And there's a certain comfort or a certain warmth or welcomeness when you're listening to something that you're familiar with.
Yeah.
Yeah. yeah. It's like, I think
It's like a fuzzy blanket.
yeah,
It's
like Wolfman Jack once said, he was talking about oldies, and he said, "Oh, oldies are like a good old pair of jeans that you've had for years, and they fit you perfect, and you put them on, and they're nice and comfy."
Yeah.
And I couldn't think of a better way of describing it.
Reliable.
Yes, yes.
Yeah. What was your first concert that you ever saw?
Wow. Probably the Beach Boys.
Okay.
They came.
Was it the late 80s?
Yes, they did a show at Parley Beach.
I was at the show.
Were you?
Yeah.
Cool. I don't think I knew that.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't know where you were, but I was way, way, way in the back, and I could hardly see the stage. And then at one point it started to pour.
Right.
And I just remember being soaked, but the music sounded awesome.
Yeah.
I don't think Brian was there that day.
I don't think so.
Yeah. But on the other side of the coin, I actually did see Brian Wilson just a few months ago.
That's right, in the Moncton
Casino.
Yeah,
right. And he was fantastic.
Yeah.
I never in a million years ever thought I would be in the same room as Brian Wilson, and there he was. But yeah, the Beach Boys show was, I think, probably one of the first ones. Yeah.
Okay.
I actually remember.
That seems late to me.
How old was I? I was like 17?
Okay.
16, 17.
Okay.
Yeah.
My first show was actually Billy Idol when I was about, I think I was about 13.
Cool.
Yeah, I was at the Aiken Center at Fredericton.
I think you'd mentioned that, yeah.
Platinum Blonde was supposed to open, but one of their equipment vans went off the road and they couldn't play.
Okay.
So Mark Holmes, the lead singer of Platinum Blonde, came out and said, "Oh, sorry, we can't play." And like everybody just lost their shit. I was like, "Oh my God."
Oh no.
And then Billy Idol made the crowd wait and wait and wait. But then when he finally came out, it was like, whoa, baby.
Cool.
This is loud.
Oh, I love it.
Yeah.
Love it.
But that was a great show.
I remember
it was $12 to get in.
$12.
$12,
Wow.
Yeah.
I actually remember, like, on the subject of 80s new wave, when I was about 16, a flock of seagulls came to St. John, and they played at a pub uptown. I think there used to be a pub called the Old Grey Mare or something like that. And I remember being so heartbroken because I was only 16 and I couldn't get in. But then about, I don't know, 9 or 10 years later, I was at my job, and one of my coworkers, we were just talking about music and shows and concerts, and someone said something about a flock of seagulls, and I said, "What?" And come to find out, they were at that show.
Okay.
And I didn't feel so bad because I looked at her and I said, "So how was the show?" And she was like, "Oh my God, it was terrible."
So bad. Because it was just the lead singer, right? That was the only original member?
So, yeah. I
think they played in Fredericton as well on that tour. They played at the Social Club.
Right. Well, according to this girl, I don't know, I think she said they were like half drunk and playing terribly, and the guy's voice was shot, and so I didn't feel so bad about missing the show.
Yeah. That's kind of sad.
Yeah.
Now, Gary, you also, on the subject of where people can find you on the internet or even around town, if anyone wanted to, and again, I may have mentioned this last time you were on, but it's never a bad idea to reiterate. But people finding your music online, I know you've got lots of videos on YouTube. People can see some of your old live performances, which are amazing, as well as some of your songs, like your studio songs.
Yes.
But do you have like Bandcamp, or where can people find or purchase your music?
Definitely. For quite some time now, Bandcamp has been the primary source. Okay.
So would that be garyflanagan.bandcamp.com?
That's correct.
Okay.
Yeah. Pretty much all of my albums are on Bandcamp.
Oh, sweet.
I'm hoping with the new album, I'm hoping to branch out a bit and have it available in a few other venues.
Okay.
And also, I'm still quite old school. I still like CDs, so I'm hoping with the new album there will be a run of CDs.
Nice.
So I'm hoping I'll have that in local stores as well. So
nice.
Yeah.
And so you're looking at it sometime this year, but you're not sure exactly when.
Yeah. A lot of my albums have been released in the fall.
Okay.
That wasn't deliberate. It just worked out that way.
Okay. But is fall your favorite season?
I do like fall. I like fall a lot. Yeah. I think summer's my favorite, but fall would be a close second.
Right.
But yeah, hopefully fall. But if not fall, maybe late fall, early winter, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm very excited, and I'm very optimistic. I just think I've learned a lot over the years, and I feel that I'm a much better songwriter and musician now than I was 20 years ago, which I think is natural for a lot of songwriters and musicians. So I'm confident that the new album will be.
Okay. Now, Gary, this is the thing I've been wanting to ask you, and we touched on it last time you were here, but tying in with the new album, and I know you do have anxiety, as do I. Is there any chance we will see Gary Flanagan live on stage again?
That's very possible. That's very possible.
I don't mean to put you on the spot, but I'm curious, and I know I'm not the only one in St. John that's like, when's Gary gonna play?
Well, I'm always very flattered and very just very pleased when people tell me how much they enjoyed my shows. I love that. I genuinely do, and I would just like to say a sincere thank you to everyone who's given me positive feedback on my shows, and it's a very special thing. And I'm not just saying this to sound good. I quite frankly, some of the best shows I ever did were in St. John. And I think I heard someone talking about this on the previous show, that St. Johners are known to be very supportive and very helpful, and they're quick to help people around them. And I think that was a big reason why I used to find the local shows so rewarding. Well,
yeah, and on the last show you did make, I did pick up on one thing you mentioned, which was like, even when you were feeling really anxious and weren't sure of yourself, and you did a show and then it was over and you were like just kind of like stumbling off the stage, but somebody would say something positive to you at the end of that set, and it would lift you right up to the highs.
Oh, very much so. And I would encourage anyone, if there's a band that you like a local band or a local singer that you really think is cool, go up to them after their set and tell them that. Seriously.
Oh, yeah.
I can't tell you, there's been numerous times in my past where I've come like this close to just totally giving up on music.
Yep, you mentioned that last time as well, yeah.
And it can be just that one brief passing comment that will just completely change everything.
Totally.
And I've had little fleeting comments like that just made me, just revitalized me and made me completely want to get back into it.
Yeah.
But in terms of shows, I would never say never. It's been a while. I feel I'm a bit rusty. And I've had some invitations to do different shows, which I'm very, very grateful for. But I think that it's very, very possible.
Okay. Yeah, and I think maybe now, if anyone out there is listening and wondering what the Gary Flanagan experience was like back in the early 2000s, there are some really, really wonderful videos on YouTube of Gary playing live and dancing and doing theatrics and handing out candy and all that kind of stuff. But I think maybe if you did a show now, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think where your music has matured and you're singing about maybe or you're singing in a more serious tone, or you're being a little more reflective with your lyrics, that could translate really nicely to the stage if the environment was a little bit more kind of quiet and creative and meditative almost, in a sense. Like I could really see you at Taco Pica on a Friday night just doing like a mellow set or something like that. Or
that's I mean anything's possible. I've always been, and we've talked about this, I have a background in photography and visuals and video
and theater.
I would love to do something, again, if I ever had the guts and I ever found the composure to do this, I'd love to do something very multimedia. that is, projections, video, maybe even a little bit of acting, and maybe getting a couple of local
performance
actors.
art kind of thing.
Yes, and maybe to have not so much a theatrical piece, or not even so much a discernible story, but just to have sort of little vignettes where people would act a little thing that would tie into the song that they just heard, or I don't know. I love that sort of thing.
That sounds really interesting.
Yeah, I love. My problem is I have no struggle coming up with ideas. I have ideas all the time, but my problem is actually fleshing them out and making them real. Like I'll have an idea in my head for a novel, and I'll have an idea for an album, and an idea for a movie. And it's great to have ideas, but I'm learning that I'm trying to train myself to actually start realizing them and making them happen.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the artist's burden, really, is to have an overactive imagination and not enough money, time, resources to see it all come to fruition, right?
And I think my biggest problem is it's not so much money, it's more lack of self-esteem. And that's been a struggle of mine from the time I was a kid. And I've had these wonderful ideas for videos and films and things, but and I've been driving people insane for years talking about various projects, but never actually pursuing them. And I've been doing a lot of soul searching in my 40s and really realizing that, it's time to stop being scared and time to start creating. And actually, okay, enough with the fear, enough with the low self-esteem. Come on now, just do it.
Yeah, and I feel like that's how we ended last time. We were talking a lot about like pursuing things. I think now, again, I'm not sure, but I feel like you said if you're out there listening and you're thinking about doing something creative, to just go do it. Yeah. And like, I think in a lot of times, it's about networking too. And it's about if you go out and you see somebody who's doing something and you think, oh man, I'd like to do something like that. Yeah. Then it's like, go talk to that person and find out how they do it, and then go home and start working in your laboratory on all those crazy beats, and then get out there.
Oh, very, very much so. There seems to be, and maybe I'm just speaking for myself, but for the longest time, I had this terrible thought in my head that, well, if it's not going to be amazing and brilliant and a masterpiece, I'm not going to bother doing it. And I'm learning as I get older that that's very silly to think that way. Yeah. And that it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't have to be a masterpiece. Just the fact that you created it makes it awesome and makes it great. Right.
It's hard though when you're the and I think now I feel like you and I have some similarities in the sense that like when you were doing your electronic music, you were one of a few doing it amongst a scene of, especially because the underground music scene was like mostly rock and punk and metal and that kind of thing. So there's that sort of isolation of being an electronic artist amongst all of these rock bands. Yeah. And I kind of feel that way now, starting out on my electronic music stuff, that I'm now opening for all these like 4 and 5 piece rock bands that are like just huge and like big volume and like really loud, and here's me with my laptop like, hey gang, like let's make this happen. So I feel like there's like a bit of like just awkwardness that you create for yourself when you're kind of an outsider within a scene like that.
I think so. Oh, very much so. And you said a very key word, outsider. And I was thinking about this earlier today, that I've always been a misfit. I've never, ever fit in once in my entire life. And, I was always the weirdo, and I was always the one that nobody wanted on their team. And for years, that bothered me. That bothered me a lot. Absolutely. But again, and I keep saying this, that, with age comes perception and insight, and again, I know this could sound cliche, but I'm glad I went through that. Yeah, because it's made me a stronger person. Right. And I wouldn't want to have had a very cookie cutter experience, you know, because what I do, what I create, my art, all of that, music, photography, everything, it wouldn't be what it is today if I hadn't gone through that.
Right.
So, you know, and I am who I am. I do tend to be a bit of a loner and a bit of a recluse. And again, for a time, I thought that was wrong and there was something wrong with that.
Right.
But I've realized that this is me. This is the way I am.
Yeah.
And,
well, and I think that ties back into where we started from, which was like being a grown-up.
Right.
And then like when you don't feel like everybody else, then you think there's something wrong. But then I feel like maybe there's more freedom now, like for being that weirdo. Like,
I think so.
I think it's not as weird as it would have been like if we had been in our 40s and like the 80s.
Right.
You know, where it was like still very like nuclear family kind of like normal.
Yes.
Go to Kmart, get your slacks, you know, get your microwave dinner. And I mean, I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not that much actually. No. But I feel like now it's like people are like a little bit more like open, and the community's got more diversity, and there's just different things. And so you can kind of be that outsider, but still be part of a thing.
Yes.
Maybe.
Yeah, and it's funny how things do change. And when I think about, you know, especially the local scene, if I think about how even St. John in general, how it was back sort of in the early 90s, it's changed a lot. Mm-hmm. And a lot of it for the better. And you know, and you mentioned about like diversity and you know, certainly when I compare the way things are today with how they were 25 years ago, ethnicities, you know, there's certainly a lot more ethnic diversity,
right?
Which I think is awesome. And you know, and what's funny is, you know, it almost sounds like we're getting away from music again, but I do think there is a connect. And I remember I did an interview years ago with Martin Rev of Suicide, and who was a huge idol of mine. And I asked him, you know, do you think do you think that New York has had an impact on your music, like the actual city of New York? Mm-hmm. And he said, oh, definitely. Mm-hmm. The rhythm of the subways, the way, the structures, the buildings, the skyscrapers, the traffic, the street lights, all of that creates a tempo and a rhythm, and that affects how someone turns their head, how someone talks, how someone looks. It's all sort of intertwined. Mm-hmm. And I do think... do you think St. John impacts the sound that comes out of St. John? Oh, I think so. I think so, yeah. One thing I've always loved about St. John is it's a seaport town. And a seaport town always has... A lot of seaport towns, like if you look around the world, they have kind of an edge to them, a kind of a grit. Mm-hmm. And I think that can be very beneficial to the art that comes out of that town. And also because traditionally when you had like a port town, by its very nature, you had a lot of, you know, boats coming in. So you'd have a lot of different cultures and different ethnicities coming into that city, and invariably having an impact on the culture, the food, the music, everything.
Yeah, and I always felt like, because I grew up in Fredericton, and not to say that there weren't like angry sounding bands or angry sounding music, because there definitely was, but there was definitely lots more lighter sounds. And then kind of coming back into the music scene here around 2012, 2013, around the time I met you, and then learning about local bands here, it seemed to me that it was like, whoa, there's like lots of tough guys around here. Like it's like kind of like more of a chain gang almost kind of a mentality. Yes. I thought that was always really charming. Gary, believe it or not, our time is up. Wow. I know, an hour goes by so fast.
It does.
You brought a CD, I brought some CDs, and clearly but we will go out on a tune.
Sure.
I was kind of eyeing the song title "Streetlights and Lonely Nights."
Yeah,
is that one you would be content with listening to?
Sure.
So you have a minute to describe this song.
Okay, this song, I did an album in 2008, and the album was called Demerascata, and people have asked me, where did that title come from? Very good question. I found out that my musical idol, Vince Clarke, who was one of the founding members of Depeche Mode, I found out through accident that he was living in a small town in Maine, Damariscotta, Maine. And I was absolutely gobsmacked to find out that my musical idol was living that close to me.
Right.
So I basically did a whole album inspired by Vince Clarke, and I named it after the town where he lived.
Okay, cool.
And Streetlights and Lonely Nights is kind of a nod to sort of the early Depeche Mode kind of dance music.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Gary, it's been a real pleasure having you on the show a second time.
Thank you so much.
I feel like we could have a third part.
Yes.
I don't want to push the limits, but go to garyflanagan.bandcamp.com to check out more of Gary's music. We're going to go out with Streetlights and Lonely Nights, and I'll be back in about 4 or 5 minutes with my other radio show, Riddle of Steel. So stick around for that. And thanks again, Gary.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right.